Hi, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. My name is Michael Kranstorff, and I'm the chairman of the JNF. It's really great to be here this evening. We've had an amazing response to the webinar. I think from all over the country. A big thank you to our partners, the Zionist Federation National and the Zionist Federation in Cape Town, on this webinar. I think, with what's been happening in the world at the moment, in December, before we went away on holiday, we started with the attacks in Bondi. And for South African Jews, I think this year has also been quite traumatic with the expulsion of the Deputy Ambassador, Ariel Seidman, and now the Rodin affair. I think the tremendous response to the webinar goes to the core of the anxiety that we as Jews feel about our place in the world. And we have tonight some really great speakers to sort of unpack this and what our future is as Jews in a post-October 7th world. I'd like to start by handing over to Josh Yoshevitz. A big welcome to him. He's just joined us recently from Israel. He's the new director of the Zionist Federation in Cape Town. So a big welcome. I'm sure everyone will get to know Josh a lot better over the next few years, but a big welcome to Josh. Josh, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Michael. Good evening and welcome to the webinar, Jews in the World, Anti-Semitism, Campus Conflict, and the New Geopolitics. Firstly, there were a few people who asked if there was a typo on the poster. There was not. There are, in fact, two Mark Oppenheimers. They are both experts in the same subject. And so, yeah, there was no typo. At a time of intensifying global polarization, rising anti-Semitism, mounting tensions on university campuses, conversations about Jewish identity, Israel, and the shifting geopolitical landscape have taken on a new urgency. Tonight, we bring together two leading experts to talk about this, to unpack the questions, to unpack the content, and give us an informed and nuanced opinion about it. We are honored to welcome American Mark Oppenheimer. He's the executive editor of Arc Magazine, a former beliefs columnist for the New York Times, a widely published author on religion, politics, Jewish life. He started a podcast, Unorthodox. He brings with himself a deep historical insight and a keen understanding of how Jewish identity and public discourse intersect in contemporary society. Next to him, well, not next to him virtually, is Mark Oppenheimer from South Africa, the Mark we all know quite well, a prominent South African advocate, constitutional law expert, member of the Johannesburg Bar. He has become a leading voice in our community and debates surrounding Israel, international law, anti-Semitism at UCT, South Africa's foreign policy in general, offering a constitutional and geopolitical view on some of the most contested issues for us as South African Jews. Together, our speakers will explore the evolving experience of Jews in today's world, the resurgence of anti-Semitism, dynamics of campus conflict, and broader geopolitical shifts reshaping global alignments and how we interact with the world. Over to you, Mark and Mark.
Well, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Josh. So Mark and I have known each other for quite a number of years, and I was also inundated with people saying there must be a typo, but there really are two of us. Mark is, of course, the more handsome Mark Oppenheimer and the more intelligent Mark Oppenheimer, and also wrote a fantastic book on the Squirrel Hill attack, which was one of the most devastating attacks at a synagogue in America. And I thought that might be an interesting place for us to start. It's in about 2018. It's before October 7th. What's an interesting thing about South Africa is that we have quite a small community, but we have never had any serious attacks on our schools or our synagogues. And part of the thought is that because we have, an issue with crime in South Africa, that we've always had armed guards outside of our synagogues. That when we have Yom Ha'atzmaut, celebrations, you have an enormous perimeter, with citizens who are very well armed, carrying Uzis or AK-47s, and there have been no incidences. And I gather that America has changed quite a lot, since the Tree of Life shooting. I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'll put it right back at you and say that you are the handsomer Mark Oppenheimer and probably taller. I forget we met in New York, and I don't think either one of us was ready for pro basketball. But thank you for having me. It's an honor. And yes. So the many of you, of course, throughout the world know about the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood, which is a historically Jewish neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That was October 27th, 2018. My father is from a family that has been in Pittsburgh since the 1840s and has been in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood for several generations. So although I wasn't raised there, that was my family heritage. That was our yichus. And I wrote a book about it, about the shooting and its effect. And yes, it was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in North American history. I often try to explain to people who come from European contexts where there's such a history of wars of religion that the United States is where people immigrate to stop fighting. We are a country that has done an exception for all of our flaws, and of course, chattel slavery, which didn't end until 1865. The war was being fought 1861 to 65. For all of our flaws, and of course our treatment of our native peoples as well, we have been a place where groups that historically have been in conflict elsewhere in the world, let's say Europe or Africa or elsewhere, come here and then more or less forget about those conflicts. So people who are from warring tribes in much of the world today can come and settle in New York City. The Queens neighborhood is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the world. Hundreds of languages spoken there, and work side by side in a restaurant, in a law firm, in wherever. We are a place where people come not to kill each other, is what I always say, and that has historically largely been true. It has also been true that while we've had episodes of anti-Semitism, it has often been on what I call the British model, which might have some explanatory power for South Africa as well. England has, of course, had anti-Semitism for a good millennium or so, but for the past several hundred years has had almost no physical violence against Jews. And what I've said is it's a place where the anti-Semitism can get very bad in terms of who wants to, attend which boarding school with whom, or which Oxford college, or, which law firm, whose chambers. It's a very clubby, quiet, whispered anti-Semitism. And that has been very pernicious at times in England. And still, people have felt physically safe. And that historically has been a pretty good model for how to think about the United States, which is that, yes, there have been periods of very bad anti-Semitism and yet physical safety. And so until about, well, really until 2018, and it got worse after October 7th, after the Gaza, the attacks by Hamas, almost none of our synagogues had armed guards. You would see it in big cities, New York and LA, but where I live, in a medium-sized town in Connecticut, we had never had armed guards, except perhaps on the high holidays, we might have one. So yes, there's been an extraordinary change, and we now have security consulting firms coming in whom we, will hire, or the Jewish Federation of a given city will hire, and say, what do we do to harden our borders? And they'll say, build guard towers, build perimeter fences. And, and by the way, that'll be $1 million, which our communities don't have. So there's a tremendous discussion going on right now about how much security is enough. When can you breathe? When can you exhale? We are also a country where, despite our reputation for being the Wild West when it comes to owning firearms, where most people don't own firearms. And I would say the urban Jewish communities in particular tend not to have a lot of firearm owners. So it's not as if we're all packing guns. And so my Israeli friends will say, why do you have guards on the outside? All you need is 5 or 6 sharpshooters on the inside. And you don't have to worry about anything. But that's not the reality in which we live. So yes, post Pittsburgh in 2018, things got more tense, and then things really ratcheted up after October 7th, 2023.
So it's interesting that we had this incident that's made the press here for the last week, between King David and Rodin. Our viewers will know well about it.
I've been reading about that, yeah.
And one of the things that was interesting that was said was that the Rodin girls had played tennis at King David, and they said, deeply traumatized by 2 things. The one was the presence of armed guards outside the school, and the other one was the presence of posters displaying hostages. And I thought, there's something, I suppose, that Jews have had to get used to, the idea that, to protect your children, you have armed guards. And that, when, Jews are kidnapped and held hostage, for months on end, some 500 days, that you recognize them and you mourn them and you mourn them globally. I mean, those hostage posters were found, wherever there were Jewish communities. They were sort of seen as, our community, trapped in Gaza tunnels. And it's interesting that the Rodin girls found this traumatizing, as opposed to having a sense of empathy to say, wow, we don't have to do that in our community. And we'd like to support you in yours. And it was given as a reason for why they didn't want to play tennis at their own school at Rodin. What's interesting about these things is we had recordings that came out between the two headmistresses discussing what had occurred. And Israel is not really mentioned at all. The headmistress from Rodin talks about it being a Jewish day school issue. But the subsequent discussion about it has very much tried to downplay the Jewishness and play up the
Israeliness.
Zionist school. Exactly, the Israeliness. And so I wonder how that happens in the States. How do you sort of navigate this path between, people who say, well, I don't have a problem with Jews. In fact, I love Jews. My best friends are Jews. But I really don't like you Zionist pigs who are committing a genocide.
Right. It happens all the time. Right. And of course, I know people across the spectrum of honesty and integrity on this question. I know people who are, whom I've known to be sincere anti-Zionists, who really don't have antipathy toward Jews. And this would include these people themselves might be Jewish or might not be, and have had a track record for 30 years. And some of them are actually quite good about holding all countries to the same standards. They are actually sincerely concerned about the atrocities in the Sudan. They're sincerely concerned about the concentration camps that China puts the Uyghurs in. They're sincerely concerned about the hanging or decapitations of queer people in several Muslim countries, right? And there's an integrity there. They're a tiny minority, right? Then at the other extreme, you have people who, you can see them wanting to say Jew, but then they remember to say Zionist or Israeli at the last moment, but really they're thinking Jew, Jew, Jew. And then you have people in the middle for whom the slippage is sometimes unconscious, sometimes malevolent, sometimes benign. And so it puts Jews, of course, in the position of trying all the time to figure out, who are the people who wish us ill? Who are the people who care about us? Who are the people lying to our faces? What was so interesting, and I read up on this controversy that you've had in South Africa, and I should say, as a tennis player and the father of teenage girls, I felt like this was coming right for my family. Like girls high school tennis. If this can't be depoliticized and made sacred, what can be, right? What was so interesting about that was the clear sort of dissembling. I mean, the lying, where the tapes come out and you look at the shift where they're clearly talking about Jews. Oh, now no, it's about Israel. Then you have I don't know if you saw about the Swiss broadcaster who was making the comments about the Israeli bobsled team. I mean, wouldn't just comment on their fairly inept bobsledding. They're valiant but inept bobsledding, but had to make comments about them as Zionists and genociders and so forth. So for some people, they're just really identical ways of talking about the same thing. The United States has been such a happy place to be Jewish for so long that I think we are years behind where much of the Anglosphere is in thinking. I mean, England, we haven't had our Jeremy Corbyn. We haven't had our national politician who for a couple decades was winking and signaling at the anti-Semites, but trying to use anti-Zionist language as much as possible. We just haven't had that. And when they survey people about what religious community they have warm feelings towards, they do these polls of all groups and say, how do you feel about all groups? How do you feel about Roman Catholics, Protestants, Quakers, Jews, Mormons, and they'll often throw in atheists, for example. Jews almost always rank near the top in terms of people's positive perceptions of us. That is to say, people want to live in a Jewish neighborhood. They figure the schools will be good. They figure it will be safe. Like people don't have a sense that Jews pollute them the way that racists have a sense that black people pollute them, right? So there's a way in which it's very happy to be Jewish in America. But then when you get into these conversations, yes, people are all the time dropping anti-Zionist when what they really mean is we don't want Jews around. And I think you'll see it a lot within person to person. People are usually a little more careful because they do have good Jewish friends. But that kind of thing of we're not going to play against this school, this faceless institution. We're going to take out our politics on this institution of teenagers is something you're seeing more and more of. So a Jewish team will be playing another team at a basketball tournament, and the fans on one side will be shouting anti-Semitic stuff, and you would not have seen that 10 years ago.
So you did this fantastic podcast series called Gate Crashes, which I hope everyone tunes into. And it traces the idea of anti-Semitism at the Ivy League, and you look at a number of, different institutions. And one of the things that I always grew up with, and I think many of us would have grown up with, is that there were these quotas at schools, and you go into that and you sort of say a bit more complicated, and then you sort of reflect on your time at Yale in the 90s, and you say this was a golden era to be Jewish, that
Yeah.
you had so many Jews on campus, so many Jews teaching and studying, and now we seem to have had a dip in Jewish numbers in the Ivy. Still vastly overrepresented from our numbers. I don't buy
Yeah.
into the idea of overrepresentation. I think let in the best people and you'll get anomalies in all sorts of ways. But there's a sense that Jews care about education, we care about learning, we care about literacy. What is your sense of, in the last couple of years, what the space is for Jews on campus?
Yeah, I will answer that question if you promise to tell me how things are in South Africa as well, because I don't. This shouldn't be the America Hour, although I always love, as a good patriot, I love talking about my country. I want to learn more about what it's like to be the other Mark Oppenheimer. So yes, I mean the rough 1 minute version is that in the early 20th century, Jews were beginning to be very overrepresented, say before World War I, on a lot of campuses, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, a lot of our elite Northeastern campuses. And then measures were instituted by the administrations to squash the numbers down. There were never actual quotas, which would imply a floor and a ceiling, I think, but it would imply a floor, like get 10%, but then no more, let's say. What there were just kind of scattershot measures to exclude Jews. So they would start, they wouldn't ask if you were Jewish, but they would say, what was your mother's maiden name? Or they would say, what did your grandfather do for a living? And if your grandfather was a butcher or a shoemaker or something, they just wouldn't admit you because the Gentiles, the Protestants, their grandfathers were bankers or attorneys. That's also when you began to get legacy preferences at these schools. So if your father went there, they would be more likely to admit you. In 1910 or 1920, that meant admitting more Protestants because the Jews were recent immigrants. Their fathers hadn't gone there. So all of these things we still carry with us today. A lot of these sort of what seemed like benign diversity measures were actually instituted to keep Jews out. So geographical diversity, let's get more students from rural areas, from the farms. Well, that was an attempt in 1910 or 20 to get more Protestants. But we still have it, and we think of it as benign. We want students from all 50 states. These measures fell away after World War II, and by the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of these campuses were a quarter Jewish, perhaps, maybe more like 15 to 20%. We don't really know, but quite high. And American Jewry is at most 2% of our population. Is that more or less than South Africa, by the way? What's the percentage? Do you know?
Yeah, so South Africa, there's 60 million people, and there are about, at max, 60,000 Jews. At our height, there
Oh
were
my
about
goodness.
150,000. So people vastly overestimate how many Jews there are in
Yeah.
the world. I think Joe Rogan recently took a guess of 500 million.
When
So
it's
we
12 or
do
13
punch.
million, right?
Yeah. A nice little case for me was the EGOT is like one of the hardest things to get, and
Right.
it's an Emmy,
Emmy,
and
Grammy, Oscar, Tony, all of our 4 big
yeah,
entertainment prizes. Yeah.
and there are only 20 people have them, and 9 of them are Jews. So we do all right for ourselves.
I don't have any of the 4. And I mean, that doesn't even count, me and my aspirations to have a Grammy, Oscar, Tony. It was very much what I call peak Jew, which was, when I was at Yale in the 90s, the school was, again, I don't know if it was, it was at least 10% and it might have been 20, and we just don't know. And of course, how do you count people who are ancestrally Jewish but don't identify or don't participate in the community? There's all these questions of demography. But since 2000, those numbers have come way down. And so you would now, Harvard does a survey every year of its first year class, its freshman class. And lately the numbers have been showing that only 7 or 8% of students identify as Jewish. And the interesting question, of course, is, are they going to other schools? Are they now, to some extent, they're kept out by affirmative action, or what much of the world calls positive discrimination. Those measures have brought up other communities. A huge piece of it is our increasing, and Trump has complicated this, but our increasing outreach to international students. So a lot of these schools which were 1% international, non-American when I was there, are 10% now. And the reason is because we charge those students full freight. We don't give financial aid to students from East Asia, the Arab Peninsula, plutocrats from every continent, Africa, Asia, Europe. So they're good deals. They're very bright and often quite better prepared than Americans, and they pay the full $80,000. So when you take 10% of your spots and give them to other countries, which don't tend to send Jews or have Jews, you're squeezing out the number of native Americans and you're squeezing out a lot of Jews. So there's a lot of reasons for this that aren't anti-Semitism per se, but there's also some thought that many Jews are not attending these historically elite schools because of left-wing politics that has trended anti-Semitic. And the interesting thing there is, we were saying before we went live that, for the past 4 or 5 years, the anti-Semitism has felt like it comes from the left on campuses anyway. And that may be changing. We're now just over the past few months seeing a lot of anti-Semitism, increasing amounts of visible anti-Semitism coming from right-wing bloggers and politicians. So if that's where it's coming from, maybe then Jews will want to go back to Yale and Harvard. So it's but I'm curious on your campuses. And of course, we had the encampments, the pro-Palestinian encampments as well, which, I think we would both support as a matter of free speech, but often had anti-Semitic elements. So I'm curious how things are going in Cape Town and South Africa and the places you know best.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, our government has obviously taken a very strong stance by launching a case at the International Court of Justice. Our president and senior government ministers would, wear keffiyehs, would sing "From the River to the Sea." There was no, winking about any of it. I mean, our government representatives met with Hamas. They flew to Iran. It's been quite overt. And the government has a fair amount of control at universities. So I'm a member of UCT's council. There are 30 seats. 5 of them are directly appointed by the Minister of Higher Education, and a number of others are co-opted. So you have a big kind of government influence. The University of Cape Town passed the notorious boycott, preventing its academics from doing any research collaboration with Israeli academics. They phrased it as with anyone who has an IDF author affiliation, but they haven't worked out what that really means. And given that you have conscription in Israel, they, once when we were required to test it, asked people to sign an affidavit saying, were you ever a member of the IDF? So it implies that it's all Israelis. They've also had quite severe anti-Semitic incidences on campus. So we have a thing called Israel Apartheid Week that's been sort of happening over the last decade or so. And after October 7th, you had Israeli flags covered in blood. You had Jewish students being attacked with their yarmulkes knocked off. You had people wearing shirts that said, Hamas the resistance, and screaming at Jews, we are Hamas. And the university hasn't really covered itself in glory in terms of dealing with that. There's litigation. So one of the professors in history sued the university on the basis that it's an infringement of his academic freedom rights, because as an academic, you need to be able to collaborate with people of all different backgrounds. You need to find out what's actually true. And what's interesting about the South African Constitution is we have a right to freedom of expression, but it specifically mentions the right to academic freedom as well. And because in South Africa, public universities are organs of state, they have an additional duty to uphold those academic freedom rights. So that case has been argued, and we await a judgment. The further aspect of it that was interesting is that the chair of council had signed an agreement with the Donald Gordon Foundation, accepting a 250 million rand donation, which would be then used for the health sciences department at UCT, which is regarded as world class, and that there would be further the donation of a hospital. And the requirement was that you must have a zero tolerance policy towards anti-Semitism, and that the definition of anti-Semitism is the IRA definition. And one of the things that council did, in addition to the boycott, was to remove the IRA definition. And so that money was lost. And, it was also kept from the other members of council. So even though the chair of council had this information, when they decided to vote about, what should we do on the boycott, I was not a council member at the time. I came in afterwards. They were left in the dark about this 250 million rand loss. And so that's an aspect of the litigation.
I should say that, in the United States, a lot of our most elite universities are private, although they receive, a lot of federal funds. And so Donald Trump who has hated the universities, although he's a graduate of a very prestigious elite Ivy League university, the University of Pennsylvania, which despite its name is not public. Pennsylvania State University is public, but University of Pennsylvania is a private school. And he's an alumnus, and at least one of his children is an alumnus. But he generally hates elite universities. He thinks correctly that people of that elite ilk look down on him. And so he really wanted to come for the universities in this second term. And one of the ways he did it was by making federal science funding and research funding contingent on the universities giving into all sorts of demands some of which had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but a number of which had to do with promising to fight anti-Semitism in certain ways. I mean, the problem, of course, is that the last thing you want is for your policies to be dictated by, who wins elections every 2 and 4 years. I mean, the Congress turns over every 2 years, the presidency every 4. But we are constantly, and our House of Representatives, one of our 2 houses, has flipped several times in the past, decade. Like, we are a very, very divided country, and if you turn over policymaking to the whims of whoever's currently running the Federal Department of Education, that's just no way to have consistent good policy. It's not good stewardship of a university. So there are people who cheered Donald Trump for taking on the anti-Semitism, and certainly people on the left didn't cover themselves in glory and left a huge vacuum for him to step into. On the other hand, making cancer funding contingent on his deputies approving of the appointments of certain people on certain committees to supervise the inspection of anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily strike a lot of academics or certainly science researchers as the way to go. So I would also add that we too have this history of the boycott and divest movement on our campuses. It's often student governments passing ineffectual resolutions. But I do think that in the current climate, it often looks like a fairly benign compared to so much of what we saw in the encampments. Like, well, this is just saying you can't go do a term abroad or you can't go collaborate. And it feels almost kind of like far off and benign. But I think we'd probably be in agreement that for a university to say to people, let's say to a Jewish studies department, you can't go do Jewish studies with certain people in Israel, where so much of the world's important Jewish studies work is done, would be, imagine if you said to a Chinese studies department, no more traveling to China. Well, you can't really master Chinese unless you travel to China. I mean, that's just, you're basically saying we're not curious about this field of human endeavor anymore. So what seems to many like the kind of the least troublesome aspect and the most sort of pleasantly symbolic, I actually think of as the most troubling.
Yeah, I think there's something very dangerous about one, silencing the kind of research that you can do. I mean, what's interesting as well is South Africa is a very water scarce place, and we've had, severe drought issues. And Israelis have, you live in a desert, not much access to water, and the Israelis have pioneered a lot of water tech. And, to deny our engineers access to that information or to collaborate on those projects, seems to sort of, cut your nose off to spite your face. The ban at UCT is so draconian that if anybody in any research network, is an Israeli or has the IDF affiliation, then you can't participate. And so in a lot of the sciences, you could have 1,000 people who are part of this network, someone who's discovering a cure for cancer, and South Africa has done a lot of really impressive research on HIV and on infectious diseases. And so you suddenly make it impossible to do this collaborative work. And I'm pretty sure that not one single Gazan baby has been saved by UCT's moral stance on this. I also worry about the idea of universities feeling like they need to speak out on things. And you might think that it's important for those institutions, to be neutral. UCT had a policy of neutrality. And if you think about, the sort of Chicago principles on protecting academic freedom and protecting neutrality, it seems important. I think what upsets people is that the universities have, sort of pick and choose on how much they care about free speech on campus. So, when people are calling for genocide against the Jews and, at various Ivy Leagues, suddenly all those presidents said, well, we care about free speech. And so if you want to call for that, that's not a problem. But, go back a couple of years and any kind of microaggression was reason to be, pushed off campus.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think that there are a lot of people in our audience probably aren't, well, you and I are sort of free speech people. And therefore, I think, have probably watched a lot of the pushback, often from the Jewish community or from conservatives, let's say, against campus protests with a little bit of concern, because we really do what we want is universally applicable free speech enthusiasm, right? That is to say that people, so long as they're not physically harming others or harassing them to the point where they really can't go about their daily lives, screaming in their faces, playing loud music outside the classroom, so forth, as long as they're sort of really doing speech, they should kind of get to say what they want, and that societies have to make space for that. I mean, that's really very deeply American to me. And American free speech advocates who generally come from the left or liberal side of things, also have a long tradition of famously defending the rights of conservatives, reactionaries, all the way out to neo-fascists, neo-Nazis to speak. and expecting the defense of their rights to speak as well. So, communist, fascist, whatever, pro-choice, pro-life, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, that we work as a country because we respect the right to free speech. And so what we don't want, what I don't want, is a campus climate where criticism of Israel is not allowed. I want a campus climate where criticism of Israel, and frankly, even criticism of Jews is allowed. If some anti-Semite wants to say their thing, standing on a street corner, not bothering other people, but say it, I'm not sure that they should be expelled for that. And that's tough medicine for a lot of people. I think a lot of people, certainly in the United States, a lot of us were conditioned into what we call a snowflake ideology, that we're all precious snowflakes that could melt very easily. And our children in particular have to be protected from anything that would trouble them, no matter its politics. So when I heard you talking about the high school tennis players and their administrators saying the girls were afraid to even see, to know that there were hostages in the world, that's not a left or right problem. That's really almost a child rearing problem, I would say. And so, I'm curious, is there the same concern about South African culture? Particularly, we always talk about the children and the youth and their inability to deal with hard facts or to deal with, with adversity. But it's really everyone. Is that as much a part of the problem in South Africa as it is here in the United States?
It's interesting. I think we have this. We have different rules about free speech in South Africa. We have quite strong constitutional protections for them, and we have a small number of limitations. So in America, there is no such legal category as hate speech, although you find it, in campus codes and you find it in social media platform codes.
And you'll find it as a kind of enhancement on penalties. So if you murder, in some states, if you murder someone, well, that gets the thing that would get 30 years in prison, if they decide you murdered them because of you were animated by racial hatred, you might get an additional 10 years on top of that. They're not good laws. I mean, they're hard to apply. They're not good laws, but go ahead.
Yeah. So you have that hate crime stuff, which we have as well. I suppose, the kind of classical liberal line on it is that you should be free to swing your fist at the edge of someone's nose and no further. And, if you're going to the incitement of imminent lawless action in the States is prohibited. But that doesn't necessarily require kind of racial hatred or things like that. One reason to allow the obnoxious speech is that it gives you information. And so if you think about, the Bondi massacre, before that event, you had quite a lot of anti-Semitic graffiti, you had synagogues being attacked, you had lots of warning signs telling you, Jews are not safe. And I think the mistake is to say, silence that speech, don't let people say that stuff, but then you miss out on the warning network. And so actually what you want to do is allow people to say the obnoxious stuff and then respond to it and then say, well, hold on, we have a serious problem here. We need to start, combating the hatred, with counter speech. Maybe we need to start monitoring certain groups that might not just be saying things, but are going to plan on doing things. So I worry that when you drive the pernicious speech underground, that you miss out on information that you could use to combat, genuine acts of violence. I am sympathetic to the view that there's certain kinds of speech under certain conditions where you really can stir up a crowd sufficiently to go and perform real world active violence. And I also think you've got to draw a distinction between speech and action. So you give the example of someone on the campus who's espousing anti-Semitic stuff. That's very different from, setting up an encampment in a public space and not allowing Jews access. That's not a speech thing, it's a conduct thing. And so I think often what happens is that universities have protected things that are not about speech. They're about the invasion of private property rights. They're about the suppression of speech when you're blowing loud hailers when someone else is trying to speak. That's a suppression of free speech. It's not a free speech exercise. So having some sort of clarity about what conduct you allow and what speech you allow is really important. And it's a battle that will continue forever.
Well, that was the central question. That was the central divide in how American universities had. We had something. You could go back in the news. There were news organizations that were tracking encampments in the spring of 24 across many universities, and there were 90 or 100 significant ones, according to one, mobile interactive graph I saw. And at some universities, the universities allowed them to persist, even though they were clearly in violation of rules. You weren't allowed to. You're not allowed to sleep overnight in public spaces. That actually looks like vagrancy. And and these are students who have beds, who have dormitory rooms or apartments, and didn't need to be there. They weren't homeless people; they were people doing this for political action. And the university actually doesn't allow that, and they decided to keep allowing that because they felt they could diffuse the activist energy by playing nice for a while. And then there were schools that went in right away and cleared them out and gave a warning and said, if you're back, anyone who's back the next night is expelled or suspended. But that doesn't mean you can't be here during business hours holding a placard or marching or saying stuff. It just means you don't get to take over common space. And that, which was what happened at, that was the model used, roughly speaking, by Washington University in St. Louis, where I teach, which was, like it's not going to become an encampment. Protests are fine. Encampments are not, because the space is shared by all of the students. And that's to say nothing of the encampments where they said Zionists can't pass or journalists can't pass. I mean, as a journalist, I'll say that the contempt for journalists as people who are important to the free speech ecosystem for the left as well as the right was really, really startling. The people who assumed that anyone committing journalism was against them. The journalists, by the way, did not do a very good job. Campus journalists colluded with the protesters in most cases to not show their faces in photographs, to not name them, to not try to figure out where their funding was coming from. There were so many good stories that student newspapers missed because fundamentally they were in sympathy with the protesters, or they believed the protesters' claims that if their names were released, it would harm them in their future careers, which it might. But of course, that's not the journalist problem. That's what happens when you engage in civil disobedience or break the law to make a point, is there may be consequences. And the consequences might be part of, driving home the point of your action, is that you're willing to suffer the consequences. Getting arrested is sometimes the point. So, the campuses had a lot of problems. And I think, going back to your point, administrators learned their lesson, among other things, that they themselves should not be issuing statements. And a lot of them have gone back to the Chicago neutrality principles of, our professors and students are here to say whatever they want, but we don't have institutional positions on this stuff. And I think that's probably for the best. But, I don't want a job as a university president, so I don't want this ever to be my problem.
So I'm curious what you think the good antidotes are to anti-Semitism. So we've sort of seen this quite rapid escalation in the last couple of years. There's, I suppose, different kinds of approaches you could have. I'm a lawyer, so I see litigation as a very powerful tool in being able to, combat things that are dangerous. Or I think education can be important. I think a lot of people in South Africa, given how small the community is, have never met a Jewish person in their lives. They haven't been, sitting around Shabbos tables learning about the history of the Middle East. It might as well be, a conflict between North Sudan and South Sudan, and they're generally told the one side is committing genocide and is really evil, and the other side, are angels. So I wonder what you think are the effective things and what are the things that are worth avoiding.
Yeah, well, and of course I want to hear. Maybe you'll have good wisdom for me on that as well. I don't think there's much that can be done actually to change people's hearts. I think that the typical and increasingly derided answer is more Holocaust education, as if that somehow makes people more sympathetic to Jews today. I think that to the extent that knowledgeable Jews who feel comfortable talking about history feel comfortable speaking up in spaces where there's ignorance, that helps. I certainly think that taking politicians to the Middle East, as some American organizations do, and giving them tours and letting them see things for themselves and talk to people is probably worthwhile. But in general, I actually don't think it's the job of Jews to cure anti-Semitism. I think that anti-Semitism is an unfortunate sickness and virus that afflicts the anti-Semites. I don't think it's our job to help them. I try when I can, or if they seek help, or if they want to learn more. I try to extend hospitality, and I've brought Gentiles to my synagogue, and we've had many non-Jews around our Shabbos table. And there are small but important cases where anti-Semites will say, once I got to know Jews, I realized I didn't know anything. And so it's good to be an ambassador, but I don't think it's our job to be ambassadors. I think it's our job to be good Jews and good humans. And I think that anti-Semitism, it waxes and it wanes. I don't say that to be Pollyannish and say, oh, who don't worry about it, we'll come out the other end in 5 years. That's cold comfort to people who are attacked or abused for being Jewish. But I just think it's true, and I don't think that there are reliable antidotes. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, one of the things that seems to have played quite an important role here are taking people who are very zealous, very zealously anti-Israel, for example. There's a famous case of a guy who was at the University of Witwatersrand. He was, part of the BDS movement. I think he put a pig's head in the kosher section at a local supermarket. And
Classy.
yeah. And someone said to him,
what a lovely fellow.
yeah. Well, wait till you hear the end of the story.
Okay, I want to see where this is going, right?
Yeah. So you got someone who had a lot of venom, and someone said to him, you seem to have these very strong views about Israel. And he says, yeah, well, Israel's an apartheid state. We had the yoke of apartheid in South Africa. I'm black. It's a terrible thing that's happening. They said, well, why don't you come to Israel? We'll pay for your ticket. Come see for yourself. So he goes to the plane. First thing he does is he wants to find a bathroom. So he says to one of the guys, where's the blacks only toilet? And the Israeli says, Maze, blacks only toilet? What are you talking about? And so he spent time in Israel, and he said he wrote a public letter about it. And he said, I've grown up with this idea that Israel is this apartheid state, and I've visited and I feel nothing but rage because I was lied to for so long. And he now plays a massive role in taking out students who have very hostile views in Israel to see for themselves. And it seems to be, what's interesting is some of those students who are members of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is the most anti-Israel, radical left organization in the country, the leader of the party, Julius Malema, had said, Hamas have nothing to be ashamed about of October 7th, and when we get into government, we will arm them. And so members of their student organization went to Israel and came back not just pro-Israel, but they said pro-Netanyahu, which is like, not even that many Israelis are pro-Netanyahu. They saw, the society for itself. They went to, this Novafest site. They went to Niraz. They, saw what happened October 7th, and then they publicly write about it. And I think there's so much value in having someone who's changed their minds being able to speak to their own community and express what they've seen.
And there's a famous case in the United States. There was a great book called Rising Out of Hatred by Eli Zaslow about a college student whose father was an important racist. I mean, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, our big sort of historical white supremacist organization rooted in the South in the 19th century. He'd grown up with this, and then he went off to college. He decided he wanted a liberal arts education as a racist, went off to college, and then started, I forget the story, it's a beautiful book, getting invited to Shabbat dinners at this small college in Florida, and ended up just renouncing all of it and just becoming, and he was someone who was anti-Semitic from the right, and now speaks out very openly, in favor of amity with Jews and racial understanding. So of course, one likes those stories, and there should be more of them. I should also say that, I really do believe that everyone being exposed to everyone is the best possible situation. So, I think that universities ideally should be places where, to the extent that they're anti-Zionists, Zionists should not abuse them, but verbally, but talk to them and try to have depoliticized spaces where people begin to relate as humans, because so much of this, and you see this, I think, with the high school case you were talking about, comes from these, the sense that you can fight evil by dehumanizing people. We don't have a problem with those girls. We just have a problem with the school or with Israel, but we're going to funnel our anger through this. Well, if you make it about actual human to human relations, that really does help. And so I guess I'm a little bit sad when places that can be incubators of human to human relations, like college campuses, don't serve that function, right? I don't know what I can do out on the streets of my town in Connecticut, but when I'm teaching at a university, I really do expect students to be able to come together over meals and in classrooms and listen to each other. And so those breakdowns, the deplatforming, as we call it here, where students will try to get speakers disinvited, I think that's almost always bad.
I will say one of the things that I did last year that was difficult, but I thought important, was I debated a guy called Abdullah Andalusi in a public space on the Israel-Gaza war question. We spoke for about 2.5 hours about whether a genocide was being committed, and with quite a hostile audience. The sort of after we'd finished, a number of people there started chanting "From the river to the sea," and then "Death, death to the IDF," and then "Death, death to the Zionists." But I thought that's an audience that would not have heard what I had to say, and they had to listen to it, and they could ask me questions, and they could hear my answers, and it was recorded. And the last time I did an event like that with a guy called Mohammed Hijab, we had a completely packed crowd. It was, very tense, but a number of people came up to me afterwards and they said, just so you know, I'm Muslim and I don't believe a lot of what Mr. Hijab has said. And those kind of face-to-face encounters, I think, are very useful. And I don't think you can always change an extremist mind, But I think being able to civilly disagree with people is like a really important thing to model.
Absolutely. And, I think it's, in a sense, what you and I both do. The law and journalism both depend on it. I mean, when journalists aren't modeling civil disagreement and also, listening to both sides, trying to write fairly about all sides, that doesn't mean agreeing with all sides, but it means writing fairly about them. Then we just, in terms of journalists, we just become propagandists. And I see that on the left and the right. I mean, we've lost a lot of our magazines that used to be interested in civil disagreement within their own pages, that have realized that you get more clicks on the internet if you go far left or far right. And that's been a huge problem. And of course, lawyers know, and as you point out, my wife's a lawyer and my father's a lawyer, so I'm a lawyer adjacent. We know that the law, actually, you have to listen to both sides. That's the job. That's actually the job. So hopefully those can be models for society. In the United States, we're fighting very hard to keep that tradition, but it's really, really tough. Should we take some questions, if there are any?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. Thanks, guys. Yeah, we've got a few questions here. One was for you, American Mark. We seem to see that on the left, there's a rising, in America, rising criticism of Israel, but also on the right.
Yeah.
So there's a sense that Trump might be sort of the last pro-Israel Republican president, and Biden might be the last pro-democratic, pro-Israel president. What do you see for the future of sort of support for Israel, both on the left and the right in America? And does that worry you?
Right. Well, the most important thing to understand about Zionism, I'll say Zionism as support for Israel. I mean this, so not just not the ideology per se, but let's just use that word as general support for the American alliance with Israel. The interesting thing about Zionism in America is it's principally a Christian phenomenon. We are 2% of the country, but by some estimates, evangelical Protestants, might be 30–40% of the country or more. And historically, they have been a very Zionist group. Christian Zionism has been very, very strong. Sorry, my 7-year-old's asking me. I'll be done in like 7 minutes, babe. Maybe 9. It's winter vacation here. So it's been primarily a Christian phenomenon. So, because evangelical Christians have, for various theological reasons, been very, very supportive of not only Israel writ large as a people and an idea, but the post-1948 state of Israel as well. So the most supportive politicians, would, sure, Congress people from heavily Jewish areas like certain neighborhoods of New York City would typically be supportive of Israel, as most Congress people would have. But the real fire-breathing, like gung-ho supporters would often be Southern Baptist, Christians from Alabama, from the Deep South, who had maybe never met a Jew in their own district, but had this sense that Israel is part of, because when Jesus comes back on earth, he'll come back to, ancient Palestine. You want it to be administered by the Jews. There's all sorts of theology around that. So what's interesting is it is unsurprising to me that the Jewish support for Israel has cracked a bit. So a lot of young Jews are on the left, and we show that the farther we get from the wars of 67 and 73 and the fewer Holocaust survivors we know and all of that, unsurprisingly, Israel becomes less of a passion for many of those people. What's really interesting as well is that the influential Christian Zionists are less influential. And you're finding, so our current vice president, J.D. Vance, who grew up Protestant, has converted to Catholicism, both communities that historically have been very supportive of Israel, is kind of suborning and making nice with certain anti-Semites on the right who are really questioning the alliance with Israel. So what you're seeing, the most interesting thing in both parties that many wouldn't have predicted, is the collapse of Christian support for Israel. But yes, I think that going forward, neither party will have a presumption of Zionism among their presidential nominees the way they've had in the past.
Mark, South African Mark, there was a question for you from Carl Marinus. He's asked about, there's been some reports in the press about this Palestinian-focused curriculum that may be introduced into South African classrooms. Are you aware of this development, and do you have any views on it? I have some feedback, but you go ahead, Mark.
Yes. So yeah, there's a news story that's gone around that there'll be South African schools will be teaching an updated curriculum on the history of Palestine. And the way the article is written is that it will not be a both sides story, that it will be, let's tell you about the Nakba story. So I did a bit of research into it, and apparently it's not to be rolled out at public schools, which would require, a particular kind of curriculum that will be used at small private Islamic schools. Now, I suppose it's an interesting question what to do on the education front, because I do think if I did history, to matric. I think we spent maybe one class on the Holocaust. I don't recall there being any discussion at all about the formation of Israel. South Africa, by the way, was one of the original members of the United Nations who certified Israel as a state and voted for it. And there was, up until quite recently, a South African flag in Israel alongside all the other flags of people that commemorate Israel, and was taken down because of South Africa's case, the ICJ. I do think it's probably important for both sides to hear these contested histories. I think that the formation of Israel is a complicated thing. I think, Jews grow up with a particular version. I think Muslims grow up with a particular version. Christians probably hear a little bit of both. And I think it's important to be able to try and come to grips with where Israel's a state now, to understand the formation, the sort of where Zionism comes from as a movement. The way that Zionism is discussed is really as a slur. It's Zionists are genocideers as opposed to Jews who want a homeland in their historical birthplace. And so I think that kind of stuff is important. And so this may be an opportunity, given that it's been doing the rounds in the press, to say, well, yeah, we should care about the history of the Middle East, and students should be able to interact with it, and we should be sources that are available to them. Picking up on the Christian Zionist line, it's interesting that the Nelson Mandela Foundation has created a bounty where they're willing to pay 150,000 Rand for organizations who want to combat Christian Zionism. And I thought that's interesting that they've picked that, because the number of Jews in South Africa is quite small, but you have a big Christian community who has generally been quite pro-Israel. And so the Mandela Foundation, which has this wonderful name on the tin, but has been sort of hijacked by pernicious interests. I mean, I think it's fair to describe Mandela as himself as a Zionist. He sort of saw, Jews have a right to their own homeland, and that's what's reflected by his granddaughters who did a trip to Israel recently. And you have someone like Naledi Pandor, who had close affiliations with Iran and with Hamas, who's now the chair of the Mandela Foundation, who is spearheading this kind of anti-Israel line and specifically targeting Christian Zionists.
Yeah, it's the we recently ran an article in the magazine I edit, ARC, which is at arcmag.org, ARC with a C, that discussed this sort of this shift among Christian Zionists, and I think it's the next frontier in some ways. And I always try to make this point, both to Jews in the United States who tend to overestimate the number of Jews and the influence of Jews, and to Christians who overestimate the number and influence of Jews. That we are a more Jewish country than yours. We're at 2%. I think you're under 1% of the population, but still 2%. And the Jews are heavily concentrated in certain areas. I mean, most of the country, it's not uncommon to meet people who knew no Jews growing up, but they knew Christians who loved Israel. And 15, 20 years ago, when evangelicalism was really ascendant in the country, a lot of it was very pro-Israel evangelicalism, and there were some very, very prominent preachers who had tens of thousands of followers who just loved Israel in ways that for a lot of Jews found a little bit perplexing and mystifying, and tended to see it in a kind of idealized and uncomplicated way. They also, there was this famous series of novels, the Left Behind novels, in which the River Jordan is like bigger than the Amazon. It's like hundreds of feet wide, and there's ships going. They don't realize it's like a trickle. They think it's, they had never been to, the people who wrote the books had maybe never been to Israel, but had this sense of it as like they're massive, tall mast ships going up and down the Jordan. And they saw it in these heroic biblical terms that actually didn't correspond to reality. So, the Christian Zionist piece is very interesting. And it's unsurprising that would be the next kind of point of entry for a lot of anti-Zionists.
We've got quite a few more questions for American Mark.
Oh, gosh.
Louise Siegels asked, what's your view on New York's new mayor and the future of Jews of New York under Mamdani?
Right. Well, I should say I'm not from New York City. And as a journalist, I don't, I really do come at these things analytically rather than as endorsements. I think that, there's no reason to believe that he, so far, what I've tried to do is understand the fears of many New York Jews and others about what his mayoralty means for Jews. So I guess there are two or three things to say. One, given his history of criticism of Israel, which many have felt, has shaded into a real kind of insensitivity to Jews or contempt for Jews. What does it say symbolically that so many New Yorkers voted for him, including many, many Jews? So that's number one. Number two, I think there was some concern that he would pull back police presence in protecting Jewish communities. Were underreported the number of attacks on Jewish-looking Jews, by which I mean Orthodox Jews who presented as Jewish because of what they wore in certain neighborhoods in Brooklyn. There were so many attacks for so many months over the past 5 years that went unreported or underreported. And there was also concern that the city wasn't paying a lot of attention under the past couple mayoralties. He did retain his police chief, Jessica Tisch, who is ancestrally Jewish from a very wealthy Jewish family, the Tisches, that's been prominent in New York for a long time. And people have some confidence that she takes these things seriously. So that was probably politically a good move. I think he has a tin ear on certain things with regard to the Jewish community. I don't think it's a community he knows well. Here's what I would say. What I would say is, in some ways, Mamdani, who is so young and comes out of a sort of contemporary left-wing elite culture where Jews are less prominent than they were 20 or 30 years ago, meaning Ivy League campuses, meaning democratic politics. I think one thing you can say is he doesn't kind of know Jews viscerally. He doesn't feel Jews in the way that Democratic politicians used to have to. In some ways, he's the first post-Jewish mayor, in that he shows you can now be mayor of New York City without really having a sense of Jews in his gut. He's just led a lot of his life with other ethnicities forming the bulk of his communities, of his intellectual community, of his social community. And that just didn't used to be possible in New York City politics. You had to know the Jews to understand New York City politics, particularly democratic politics. So in some ways, I think there's almost a mournful sense of that it's the passing of an era where Jews were central to the conversation. And I think, I don't know if he has as much contempt as he has sort of indifference to that community.
We've got one more question from Paul Wayburn for you. He's an American, South African, California attorney and former member of the Jewish Johannesburg Bar. He hasn't heard much about incitement that leads to murder. Elias Rodriguez killing 2 Israeli embassy staffers, a woman murdered in Boulders, Colorado. There's the Bondi Beach massacre. These people have a visceral hatred. We need to learn to defend ourselves and not speak with people who want us dead. Anyone got a response to that? How do you engage with people that sort of actually want to kill you?
I'll give my perspective on this, and I want to say I don't mean to be glib. I take these concerns seriously. As a journalist, I'll speak with basically anybody. I mean, if you grant me an interview with any sort of genocidal anti-Semitic maniac, I'll probably take the interview, because I think the job of journalists is to talk to people. So I personally, given my own vocation and what I do in life, I don't have a lot of use for the argument of certain people aren't to be spoken with, because I actually think it's important to even learn from those people where they got their ideas. We have to understand. So that's how I come at it, but I understand where he's coming from. I don't know, Mark.
The first part of Paul's point is that you don't want to be lambs to the slaughter. And I think,
sure,
it's important. The guy I met up with at the AJC was at that event when that couple were killed. He'd been emceeing it, and he said it was just such a shock, such a, burst of that bubble, the idea that people could be killed in a pretty safe city. And so I do think, a lot of Jewish friends kind of grew up with this idea that anti-Semitism is something in the past, and something that our grandparents experienced, and we're now in a global era where, that's fallen out of fashion. I think that notion has been quite quickly taken away from them, unfortunately, to sort of see these acts of violence. And so I do think you need to take things seriously. And I've often said, our enemies don't fear us, and that's a problem for us. And maybe in the States for a while, people sort of, said, well, you better not mess with the Jews. They'll get you. They've got money, they've got power, they control the media and the weather. A good friend of mine said, a lot of the anti-Semitic theories, they're only half right. And I do think we are, a community that punches above our weight, and sometimes it's important to flex our muscles. The Israelis are very unabashed about that. They know that, the surrounding states can afford to lose many wars, and they can only afford to lose one. And I think that's similar for Jewish communities that are in areas where there are a small margin. You said American Jews, it's 2%. We're at 0.1%. If you want to survive, you've got to flex a muscle and you've got to fight back.
I know we've gone over time. Can we do two more questions? Are you guys open to that?
I am.
Sure.
Thank you, Mark and Mark.
My son will watch a little more television while I talk to all of you, which is fine. Which is
More
fine. He's on
screen time for
vacation.
him.
He's earned it. He deserves it. I watched a lot as a kid. I turned out okay. Yeah, absolutely.
From Dr. Hazel Gato, she's asking about the double standard and the hypocrisy that we saw all these protests on US college campuses against Israel, but nothing for Iran in support of the Iranian protests. I would maybe add, even in the Jewish community on the left, in American Jewish support for the Iranian protests, we didn't really see very much. Not something that galvanized sort of young left-wing Jews in America. Very interesting that sort of there's been such silence on what's happening in Iran. How do you explain it?
Well, it's true that the Israel-Palestine struggle has taken on a special symbolic significance that often occludes or obscures other deadlier, more horrific conflicts, and certainly other equally painful conflicts. Iran is a particularly interesting case, right? Because there are a lot of Iranian Americans, there are a lot of Iranian Jewish Americans. We do have a history of entanglement with Iran. It's not like this country where you could say, well, of course Americans don't care. We've never had anything to do with them. I mean, Iran is, like Israel, a country that we've historically been very entwined with, and one would think there would be more attention to what's going on there, but there's not. And I think certainly. And again, I would say it's both that Israel-Palestine has become particularly important to the left, but also right now to the right. I mean, Trump said didn't he say he was going to march on Tehran if they started gunning down the protesters? And of course, then he didn't. I mean, he blinked. All of a sudden, Mr. Tough Guy, doesn't really have their backs. And so, as it turns out, most people don't care about most of the world. That's human nature, and they focus on a thing or two at a time. And I don't think anything can fix that. I don't have hopes that actually we will more thoughtfully distribute our attention when it comes to world suffering. I think that's kind of how it is.
I suppose what's galling about it is the selective outrage, so that if you have people saying, we care about human suffering, and we therefore are going to, kick up a fuss about it, and universities took up this cause of, poor women and children being killed, but then say nothing under conditions where there is no other side to the argument. The Iranian regime guns down, some estimates, the UK Sunday Times says 16,500. I was at a protest outside the American consulate. The Iranian community here estimates 33,000. That kind of total annihilation of people who are exercising their free speech rights and saying, the state has failed and we're upset about that, to kill them en masse under conditions where it's not a war. That
and what's more, and in a concentrated period of time, I mean, those were bloodier days in terms of body count than any set of days in Gaza. I mean, that was 30,000 people in a week or two, it would seem. So it's astonishing. And what's more, we have to say that there have been cases where people protesting the Iranian government in America were counter-protested by leftists who felt that it was somehow a Zionist act to protest Iran murdering its own people. I mean, these are not. So these activists are not always the most sophisticated or compassionate thinkers. I mean, that's true. It's often a disease of the mind.
Yeah, and I think for people who really do come from a place of I care about universal human rights, being able to show them what's actually going on in the broader ambit is important. I mean, to put in perspective, in South Africa, 1960, 69 people were killed in the Sharpeville massacre, and that day is recognized in our public holidays every single year, and it was seen as an outrageous action by the apartheid government to kill people who were protesting. 69 versus 33,000 is astonishing. What the South African government did now was not to denounce Iran, but rather to host a party where our Minister for Women, Children, and People with Disabilities attended the 47th anniversary of the revolution in Iran with the Iranian diplomat in Pretoria. And I understand why you would have that minister there, because many women and young people were murdered by the regime, and many of them have been rendered disabled. So it makes sense that we would send that minister to celebrate this fascist, sinister regime. So, yeah, I think pointing out that stuff is important. And I like that you started off by saying there are some people who really do care about, these issues and are equally minded, and that's important. And I think for those people, you can say, look, it's hard to accuse you of being an anti-Semite because you don't like Israel, because you also don't like other stuff
Yeah.
going on.
And as an editor, I've lost pieces as an editor from left-wing writers who are unwilling, even in a sentence or so, to acknowledge, um, you know, the problems with Hamas, quite honestly. And I've lost pieces I lost a piece from a right-wing thinker who was unwilling to, even in a sentence, acknowledge the humanity of Gazans and the fact that that it's sad when little children there die. And I mean, just that the deaths are sad. Right. And he said, well, if you acknowledge they're sad, you're implying that it's the Israelis' fault when actually it's the Hamas'. I said, no, no, no. Just that the deaths of babies are sad. And he said, nope, I'm buying into their side to even say that. I mean, I have lost pieces that I've wanted to bring into my magazine from people on both sides who are unwilling to extend any sympathy beyond who are unwilling to be thinkers. What they are is activists. And it's always the cause rather than the truth. And that's ultimately a huge problem.
Can we end with one last question for both of you? It's really, how do we respond to sort of anti-Semitism? And I think there are two sort of movements. One is sort of to disengage. You mentioned how Jews are stepping away from elite in America, from elite Ivy League spaces, and the numbers are decreasing. Do we go sort of hide into our bubble behind our walls, stick to ourselves?
I
I mean,
think it's,
the girls
I'll
of
just
King
say,
David, it's an interesting question. Now one of the part of the deal was that they're going to be playing that tennis match again with Rodin. I mean, it's quite brave of those girls to go out there on the court and play tennis with, and what will the protests be on the side? What do we do as Jews? How do we do? Hunker down, or do we engage in the world? And how do we do that? It's quite
I
difficult.
I I think it's both and. It's a great question. I think it's both and. You do both. You have to do. You be human beings. I mean, I tell my daughters who have any number of times been the only Jewish children in their schools, or the only Jewishly knowledgeable children. There have been many years when they've been the only child who can explain what Purim is or what Hanukkah celebrates. There might be other children who have Jewish ancestry but can't be the Jewish kid called on in class. And the response of a lot of Jews is, teachers shouldn't call on the one Jew and say, explain the holiday. And I've said, well, how lucky for you that sometimes you get to explain your religion to other people. How fortunate. What an honor. And no, of course we shouldn't withdraw from spaces we want to be in. If you want to go to Harvard because they have the lab you want to work in, or they have the crew team you want to row on, you shouldn't not go because they're anti-Semites. And I've had a lot of arguments with friends who've said, no, 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 we need to be building different institutions. Well, yes, you can spend your life trying to build a new university, but frankly, that's not equal participation in American citizenship. And I think that's ours. I think it's our right. I think we've earned it. So I think you keep doing whatever you would do otherwise, honestly, is my answer.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think it's important that Jews have built their own spaces in South Africa, and you have all these incredible institutions that have been built by Jews, not just for the benefit of Jews, but for many others as well. If you drive around Sands and you look at how many businesses were started by Jews, my time on UCT's council is often very fractious, very uncomfortable. I've had many discussions with, others there, find it, an assault on our dignity many times, and I think we can't allow ourselves to cede that space. Jews have played an important role at that university. We want them to continue to play an important role at that university. So as Mark says, if Jews are American citizens, then Jews in South Africa are South African citizens, and we need to, be a light onto the nations. Explain to people what our history is. Continue to be the inspiring people who, punch above our weight. And also, get your muscles ready, because you have to have some fights. I would love to have the real Mark Oppenheimer come visit us in South Africa, and I'm so delighted we've got to do this webinar together. But we have been flying out a lot of incredible Americans, to come speak to South Africans in person, and I hope that an invite is in the mail for you.
Right. Well, Be'ezrat Hashem, right? God willing. And you've, of course, been to the United States, where we've given you the grand tour. My brother bought you drinks in Texas. So it's been an honor. Thank you for having me. And, hopefully this conversation gets easier with every passing year, in that there's less to talk about.
Great, thanks, As. I'm going to hand over to Craig Pantanovitz, the co-chair of the South African Zionist Federation, to close tonight's webinar. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you so much, Mark. And first and foremost, a very big thank you to Mark and Mark, not only for the perspectives that you've shared, but for the directfulness and the thoughtfulness with which you've shared it. These are complex and often uncomfortable conversations, and even more so in a public forum. Yet tonight you've navigated them with insight, integrity, and depth. You helped us understand the current face of anti-Semitism, the tensions playing out on our schools and campuses, and the broader geopolitical shifts influencing Jewish life worldwide. That level of serious and measured engagement is something we as a community truly appreciate. Thank you to Jonamo and Moshe Zulberg for your technical expertise in getting this broadcast out. And a sincere, huge thank you to our partners at the JNF in South Africa for co-hosting this evening with us. When our communal institutions stand together, we send a message that we are coordinated, we are serious, and we're invested in the long-term strength of Jewish life. We look forward to building this partnership with the JNF and hosting many more meaningful discussions together in the months ahead. And of course, thank you very much to the South African Zionist Federation's national and Cape Council teams who work behind the scenes to make this happen. And lastly, and most importantly, I'd like to thank everyone in our community who has logged on this evening. Your presence matters. These discussions are not abstract. They affect our children on campuses, our communities, and the way Jewish identity is understood in the public square. As the chairman of the South African Zionist Federation, I believe deeply that we must continue to create spaces like this, informed, confident, and unapologetic. We will continue to host them because this is how strong communities remain strong. Thank you all for being part of it this evening, and I wish you all a very good night.